Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome you all on today's lecture, that is Theories of Interest, Module 18. I am Dr. Tilak Raj, Assistant Professor, University Business School, Punjab University, Chandigarh. Project name Swayam Prabha, DTH, MHRD, New Delhi. In ordinary language, payment made for the services of capital called interest. But in economics, the term capital is used in different context. The term capital is used to denote machines, maybe raw material, buildings, hard cash, or money. Payment made for all these services of capital is not called interest. The term interest is used for payment made only for the use of monetary capital for a specified period. And I'm sure after completion of this module, you will be able to learn the concept of interest, gross interest and net interest, constituents of gross interest, difference between net interest and gross interest, and we'll focus on three important theories of determination of rate of interest. That is classical theory of interest. Classical are the economists who believed that supply creates its own demand. Whole theory is basically supply side theory. And they assume that there's full employment in the economy, short run economy, and everything decided in the short run through market mechanism. Demand and supply forces play a very important role in the market. The point where demand for anything will intersect the supply, that will be the point of equilibrium point. New classical theory basically is the improved version of the classical theory. And third one, the liquidity preference theory of interest given by Keynes. The whole Keynesian theory basically the demand side theory. According to Keynes, demand creates its own supply, not supply creates its own demand. As classical says that supply creates its own demand, whereas Keynes says no, demand creates its own supply. So demand side theory. And this theory is basically based on the assumption of the short run and full employment, not a situation of a economy. So let us discuss one by one detail. But before that, the basic concept of interest. As we know that production of goods is not complete without efforts of all factor of production, like land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs need capital for production. He borrows it and in return pays interest to his lender. Lender has to make some sacrifice of his money or liquidity, and income earned in return of his sacrifice is called interest. Basically, interest is the reward for capital, or you can say reward for capital is known as interest. Payment made to the capital, payment made to the use of capital is interest. The owner of capital receives interest for his or her for lending his or her capital to others. Keynes says that interest is a reward for parting with liquidity for a specified period. Liquidity, cash, parting from the particular person for a specified period, and the reward given to him for this parting with liquidity for a specified period is called interest. In the words of Macaulay, interest is payment for the use of money or loanable funds. Basically, new classical theory says that interest is nothing but payment made for loanable funds is basically the interest. Second part, components of interest. Let us discuss what are the component of interest. Interest consists two main components: gross interest and net interest. Gross interest, basically the total payment made by debtor to his creditor for the use of capital, is known as gross interest. When people refer to interest, they generally refer to the gross interest. Gross interest means when the borrower pays an amount to the lender for borrowing the lender's money. The amount so paid by the borrower is known as interest, and it is called gross interest. Gross interest is equal to net interest plus a reward for taking risk of money lending, plus reward for management and other inconvenience. Basically, the gross interest include reward for risk, and risk may be two types. It can be business risk or personal risk. Business risk, we mean, or this risk arises because of uncertainty of the business. There are a lot of uncertainty in business. Maybe uncertainty due to price, due to trade cycle inflation or deflation, and maybe some other reasons. So business risk include some uncertainty of the business, and reward, basically gross interest, is the reward for this business risk. Personal risk is there. It refers to the economic condition, character, and integrity of the debtor. Reward for management, and even it also include the reward for inconvenience. Net interest is the second part, is the net interest. So net interest is that which is paid for the use of service of money alone. When we pay the reward only for the services of money, is called as net interest. Or it is a payment for the loan of capital when no risk, no inconvenience, apart from which is involved in saving, no work is entailed on the lender. Net interest is the part of gross interest generally. Let us differentiate between net interest and gross interest. Gross interest is a wide term, whereas net interest is a narrow term. Net interest only the constituent of gross interest. There is a lot of differences in the rates of gross of interest, but the rate of net interest remain more or less constant. Net interest determined by the equilibrium of demand for and supply of capital. The demand for capital and supply of capital play important role in determination of the net interest. Means where demand for capital is equal to the supply of capital, is that point is determination point of net interest. Whereas in the gross interest, other factors play important role. Not only demand for and supply of capital, there are a lot of factors which affect the gross interest. Now, there are difference in rate of interest. Why there is a differences in the rates of interest? This is due to monopoly power. Monopoly power means when there is a single person control the whole supply in a market. He behave like that the price maker. He can have a full control over the market situation, and he can discriminate the prices of the money or anything. So that's why there's a difference in the rates of interest. Second, difference in risk. Maybe sometimes there's more risk, it means more reward we have to pay for the long period or maybe short period, or there are a lot of differences in the risk. That's why it creates difference in the rates of interest. Third reason for the difference in rate of interest is called inconvenience. Fourth may be management. Fifth, the period of loan. Sixth can be security and mobility of the factor of capital, banking facilities, etc. But these are not our concern. We have to focus in this module only the determination of rate of interest, where the rate of interest is determined, what are the theories of rate of determination of rate of interest, how the rate of interest is determined. This is the more important. So interest, as I have stated, is the price paid for the services of money. Like the price determination, the rate of interest is also determined by the intersection of forces of demand for loanable funds and supply of loanable funds. Like the price of the commodity, the market mechanism play important role. Market mechanism means the demand and supply forces of the market decide the prices. The point where demand for and the supply of the commodity, that point is the equilibrium point, or that point is the determination of the price of the commodity. And the same way, the point where demand for loanable funds is equal to the supply of loanable funds, that may be the point of determination of rate of interest, but this is given by new classical. So I have already stated that there are three theories on which we have to focus: classical theory of interest, new classical theory of interest, and liquidity preference theory of interest. There are many theories, but the important theories of determination of rate of interest are three. Now let us discuss. First, what is the classical theory of interest? Classical theory is also known as saving investment theory of interest, or demand and supply theory of interest. Demand and supply theory of interest, or saving and investment theory of interest. This theory was propounded by the classical economists like Marshall, Pigou, Walras, Tozing. These are the main contributors of the classical theory of interest. They have given the classical theory of interest. According to them, or according to this theory, the rate of interest determined by the equilibrium between demand for capital and supply of capital. Demand for capital and supply of capital determine the rate of interest according to the classical theory. But this depends upon some assumptions, like assumption of full employment. Full employment means every factor of production are fully employed. Generally, full employment we mean when a needy person will get job according to his or her qualification, efficiency, training, on the prevailing base rate. Three things. Person should be needy. Second, he should be efficient. Or third, he must getting the market price, or the price which is fixed to in market, prevailing wage rate. Then we can say this is the full employment. What here full employment we mean? All factor of production are fully employed. No unemployment is there. Second, long run assumption means demand and supply play important role, and it will adjust in the long run. Long run we mean all factor of production are variable. There is no fixed factors. So second is long run assumption. Third, equality between saving and investment. Saving is equal to investment. Saving is equal to investment. Saving means income minus consumption, that is saving. Income minus consumption, that is saving. And that we have to assume equal to investment according to this theory. No importance to the monetary factor. Although these are that limitations of this theory. No importance to the monetary factor means money is neutral. Money doesn't affect the real factor of the economy. Money has only one function, that is medium of exchange. It doesn't affect the real factors like saving, investment, etc. Means the classical has not given importance to monetary phenomena in this theory. Demand for capital is only for productive uses. Fixed income. There is no change in income of the consumer or maybe country as a whole. These are some important assumptions. By assuming these assumptions, the classical theory says that the interest rate equilibrium can be determined effectively by understanding the forces of the market, that is demand for capital and supply of capital. It means we must know what is demand for capital and what is supply of capital. Now let us discuss what is demand for capital. The demand for capital is based on the productivity. Why entrepreneur demand for capital? Investor demand for capital because of capital has a productivity. The demand consists of consumption or productive purposes. Capital is demanded because of productivity. It produces demand for capital or saving for the reward is paid, basically use of capital in the form of interest. You know that the demand of factor of production are drive demand. All factor of production, whether land, labor, capital or entrepreneurs, the demand for these factor of production are derived demand. That derived demand we mean we do not consume directly. We need some product. We have to satisfy our wants with some services or the product. And to produce these commodity or product or services, we need the factor of production, including capital. So entrepreneur, the demand for capital because of they need it for producing goods and services. And the demand for capital is determined by the marginal productivity. Means more the marginal productivity, more will be the demand for a capital. When the marginal productivity per unit capital rises, the demand for capital also increase and vice versa. When the marginal productivity per unit start decreasing, the demand for capital has to start decreasing. But rate of interest has the inverse relationship. Entrepreneur employ capital to the point where rate of interest is equal to the productivity of capital. And there is an inverse relationship between the interest, between the rate of interest and demand for capital. Means higher the rate of interest, lower will be the demand for capital, and lower the interest, higher will be the demand for capital. Inverse relationship between the capital demanded hence and interest rate. This can be explained with the help of the following diagram. This diagram shows the relationship between demand for capital and rate of interest. X-axis we have demand for capital, and on the y-axis we have a rate of interest. DD is the demand curve, and I have already stated that there is an inverse relationship between quantity demanded or demand for capital and rate of interest. Means higher the rate of interest, lower the demand for capital. Say OR is the rate of interest. When OR the rate of interest, the demand for capital is only OQ. As rate of interest decrease, OR to OR1, the quantity demanded or demand for capital increase, OQ to OQ1. Higher the rate of interest, lower the demand for capital OQ, lower the rate of interest OR1, the demand for capital increases OQ to OQ1. Downward sloping of demand curve shows the inverse relationship between these two variables. If the rate of interest will increase, for example, here, see, for example, R2, then quantity demanded or demand for capital decrease. And as it is the rate of interest decreasing, the demand for capital increasing as per the classical theory. Component is supply of capital. The supply of capital depends upon the saving in the society. Savings are from individual, firms, government. Savings are affected basically several factors such as income level, standard of living, attachment of family, law and order situation of a country, security of life and property. Even political stability also affect the supply of capital. Supply of capital is influenced by two factors. One is saving and determination to save. Ability to save means the size of individual impacts their ability to save. For example, on getting a high pay, a person's income increases and she can now choose more save. That because of more income means more saving. Whereas the determination to save, saving level among the people varies depending upon their attitude toward the saving. For example, people who are pessimistic about their future tend to save more, or maybe those who are optimistic their future tend to be save less. Now, saving of capital, therefore, that there is a direct relationship between rate of interest and supply of capital or saving. Higher the rate of interest, higher will be the supply of capital. And lower the rate of interest, lower will be the supply of capital. The supply of capital and the rate of interest can be explained with the following diagram. That this diagram shows the relationship between the rate of interest and supply of capital. Relationship between rate of interest and supply of capital. As I have already stated that there is a positive relationship between rate of interest and supply of capital. See, if the rate of interest is OR1, the supply of capital is OQ. As rate of interest increase OR1 to OR, simultaneously the supply of capital increase OQ to OQ1. And suppose if the rate of interest decrease, then the supply of capital will also decrease. So there is a positive relationship between rate of interest and supply of capital according to the classical theory. Now, determination of the equilibrium rate of interest. The classical theory of rate of interest states that interest rate can be determined at the point where the demand for capital is equal to the supply of capital. Means the point where demand for capital curve will intersect the supply of capital curve, that point will be the determinant of rate of interest. This depends upon the market mechanism. Means the market forces of demand and supply, automatic adjustment. The interest rate at which demand and supply of capital are equal is equal, known as equilibrium rate of interest. This can be explained with the help of this following the table and diagram. Let us first discuss the table. Say, for example, the rate of interest is 8%, the demand for capital is 1000, supply of capital is 1800. Rate of interest will decrease 8 to 7%. The demand for capital is now increase 1000 to 12,000. It means as rate of interest decrease, the rate of the demand for capital increases. 7 to 6, then 12 to 14. 6 to 5, it is now 16, and so on. As rate of interest is decreasing, the demand for capital is increasing, but the supply of capital has positive relationship. 8%, then 1800. But as rate of interest decrease 8 to 7, then it decrease 18 to 1600, then 1400, then 1200, and at the rate of 3%, it is 800. But the equilibrium point is here, where the demand for capital is equal to supply of 6%. When the rate of interest will be 6%, this is basically demand for capital is equal to supply of capital. Let us discuss with the help of this next diagram. Now, see, this is the x-axis. We have the demand for and supply of capital, and y-axis rate of interest. DD is the demand curve, SS is the supply curve. Supply for capital, DD is the demand for capital. Now, the point where demand for capital intersect the supply of capital, this point is the equilibrium point. And here the rate of interest is OR and quantity demanded and supply is OQ. It means this is the point where the rate of interest determined. But suppose if the rate of interest will increase OR to OR1, then demand for capital start decreasing. Here demand will decrease, but the supply has positive relationship, so supply will increase. E1 to Q this is the excess supply. But contrary, if the rate of interest will decrease, OR to OR2, then the demand, because supply will decrease, but demand will be increase. Here excess demand. According to this theory, there are some forces, market forces. If the rate of interest will increase, then demand will decrease, but supply will increase. But to increase the demand, there are market forces which will decrease the rate of interest, and it will be at the point here, equilibrium point, R point R. But suppose if the rate of interest will decrease, then there are market forces because of demand is now high, which will increase the rate of interest, and again there will be the equilibrium point. The equilibrium point will be now at the point R. So according to classical theory, the point where demand for capital is equal to supply of capital, this is the point of determination of rate of interest. Now, this theory has some limitations, or this theory has been criticized by the mostly the Keynesian economist, or Keynes. Keynes criticized that the classical theory of rate of interest assume a condition of full employment. Full employment means when a needy person will get job according to his or her qualification, on the prevailing wage rate at you know that in case of in case of in case of rate of interest, the interest theory, here we assume full employment means all factor of production are fully employed. Although full employment, I have told you that when a needy person should be needy. Second, he should be efficient, means he should be educated or he has some efficiency or training. And third one, the prevailing wage rate, he must get job according to the prevailing wage rate in the market. But here full employment means all factor of production are fully employed. And in reality, basically such condition does not exist according to Keynes. So therefore this theory is not applicable in a real life situation. Next, the theory is not applicable in the short run. Keynes say there is no long run we all die. But this theory is not applicable in short run. This is again the limitation of this theory. The classical theory took into consideration only the real factors such as saving and investment while determining the real rate of interest. But Keynes criticized that the classical theory has disregarded the monetary factor. Money can also play an important role in the determination of rate of interest according to Keynes, but classical has disregarded. Classical has not considered the money as important factor. According to classical theory, rate of interest is determined at the point where demand for capital is equal to the supply of capital. This theory basically is more of the supply side theory, and therefore rate of interest can determine without knowing the rate itself. Thus Keynes said that the classical theory of rate of interest is indeterminate theory. It is not perfect theory. In the classical theory, the demand for capital is nothing but the demand for investment. However, capital may also be demanded for the purpose of such as consumption, etc. The theory makes assumption that the level of income remain fixed, which is again not true. Even a small change in investment can change the level of income. Now, next one, the new classical theory. New classical theory of interest. This theory is improved version of classical theory of interest. The theory was propounded by Wicksell, Orlin, Robinson and Pigot. It is an improvement on the classical theory of interest. It is also called loanable funds theory of interest. According to this theory, rate of interest is determined by the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. Means the point where demand for loanable funds curve intersect the supply of loanable funds curve, that is the point of determination of rate of interest. Whereas in case of classical theory, the demand for capital is equal to the supply of capital, that is the point of rate of interest. There are several factors which affect the demand for and loanable and supply of loanable funds according to new classical theory. There are various sides from which the loanable funds are demanded. Classical economists emphasized the demand for investment only, but there are several purposes for which the funds are demanded as given below according to the new classical theory. First, investment demand. The investment demand is needed for the capital, goods and other infrastructure. Interest is the cost for demand for loanable funds according to this theory. An entrepreneur invest capital to that point where the rate of interest is equal to the marginal productivity of capital. As with the increase in capital investment, the marginal productivity of capital declines. Second important part is the dissaving. When expenditure is more the current income, then it is called dissaving. Means the more expenditure on consumption is done, then the current income by the people will lead the negative saving when your consumption is more than your income. This is called dissaving. Loanable funds are demanded by such consumers who are spending more than their current income. Whose spending are more than their current income? The demand for loanable funds according to the new classical. Lower the rate of interest, higher will be the loanable demand for loanable funds, and contrary to it. Means higher the rate of interest, lower will be the demand for loanable funds. Third is demand for hoarding. People would like to hoard money or wealth, and they demand for loanable funds. Loanable funds for the hoarding purpose. Such hoarding can be used for investment in the shares and debentures or securities. Lower the rate of interest, higher will be the demand for loanable funds and vice versa. Means higher the rate of interest, lower will be the demand for loanable funds. This can be explained with the help of following diagram. This diagram shows the relationship between demand for loanable funds and rate of interest. Downward demand curve for loanable funds means higher the rate of interest. When the rate of interest is OR, then quantity demand is OQ. But when the rate of interest will decrease, for example OR to OR1, then quantity demanded will increase OQ to OQ1. It means higher the rate of interest, lower the quantity demanded for loanable funds, and lower the rate of interest, higher will be the demand for loanable funds according to new classical theory, inverse relationship. And the demand for loanable funds is equal to I plus C plus H. I means investment, plus C consumption, plus hoarding. So investment, consumption and hoarding, these three things, due to these three things are the cause for reason for demand for loanable funds. Demand for loanable funds due to investment plus consumption plus hoarding. Supply of loanable funds, second part is supply of loanable funds. There are various sources of supply of loanable funds which are given below. For example, first is saving. The most important source of saving of the loanable funds is saving. Most important factors affecting the supply of loanable funds is saving. Saving is the difference between income and consumption. If income is more than consumption, then you have some saving. So difference between income and consumption, what you consume, what you do that, what is your income, and that the difference between income and consumption is saving. Saving depends upon the level of income. Higher the income level, higher will be the saving, and maybe lower the income, lower will be the saving. Whether the household or firm or industry or government, any entity, there is direct relationship between rate of interest and saving. Higher the rate of interest, higher will be saved, and vice versa. Third is hoarding. When hoarded money or wealth is used for the consumption and the investment purpose, it is called dishoarding. When rate of interest is high, people will encourage to dishoard their saving, and it will increase the supply of loanable funds. And contrary to it, when people will not use the dishoarding, the supply of loanable funds will not increase. Third, bank credit. This supply of loanable funds is also increased by expansion or contraction of bank credit. Higher the rate of interest, more will be the bank credit, and it will increase the supply. Fourth, disinvestment. Disinvestment means the withdrawal of the amount invested by the entrepreneurs and the investors. When the disinvestment takes place, the supply of loanable funds will increase, and it will be only possible when the rate of interest is high. If the rate of interest or rate of return on investment is low, then the invested capital is withdrawn, and it will increase the supply of loanable funds. Thus, the supply of loanable funds and the rate of interest have the direct relationship we can see with the following diagram. Now see, there is a positive and proportional relationship between rate of interest and supply of loanable funds. Higher the rate of interest, higher will be the supply of loanable funds. If the rate, we have already discussed in classical, but there was supply of capital only, but here supply of loanable funds, but relationship almost same. If the OR rate of interest, supply of loanable funds is OQ. When rate of interest OR, if the rate of interest will increase OR1 to OR, then supply of loanable funds increase OQ to OQ1. Upward slope of this curve shows the positive relationship. More rate of interest means more supply of loanable funds, and less rate of interest means less supply of loanable funds. Now let us discuss where the rate of interest will determine. Determination of rate of interest. The equilibrium rate of interest will be determined at the point where demand for loanable funds cuts the supply of loanable funds. See this diagram. SS is the supply for loanable funds, DD is the demand curve for loanable funds. This supply curve shows the positive relationship with rate of interest and supply of loanable funds, and the demand curve shows the inverse relationship between demand for loanable funds and rate of interest. Higher the rate of interest, lower the demand for loanable funds. Lower the rate of interest, higher will be the demand for loanable funds. Whereas supply has positive relationship, means lower the rate of interest, lower will be the supply of loanable funds, and higher the rate of interest, higher will be the supply of loanable funds. And the point where demand for loanable funds intersect the supply of loanable funds, that is the point of equilibrium, and this will be the rate of interest, determination of rate of interest, totally based on market mechanism, where demand for and supply of the factors play important role, or the forces of demand and supply determine the equilibrium of the rate of interest. But there are some limitations in this theory also. For example, first is the wrong and unrealistic concept. The theory has taken a wrong and unrealistic concept of hoarding. The quantity of money does not increase or decrease through the process of hoarding according to Keynes. Second is the saving are not highly interest elastic according to the modern economist. The theory explains that saving are highly interest elastic, which is wrong. But in practice, we see that without any change in the rate of interest, people save more on account of family attachment or foresightedness and maybe high level of income. Third, level of income remain constant. This is again the wrong assumption. It does not remain constant basically in practical life. There is always change in the level of income on account of change in the saving and investment. Lower rate of interest encourages investment, and it increases the income of the people or society. Fourth, this theory has combined the both monetary and non-monetary factors. For example, the theory has combined basically the saving and investment are non-monetary factors, whereas bank credit and dishoarding is the monetary factors. They have been combined without changing the level of income, which is wrong. This short combination make the theory more unrealistic and imaginary. Next one, liquidity preference theory. Theory of interest is liquidity preference theory of interest. John Maynard Keynes has propounded the monetary theory of interest in his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Keynes has written a book, The General Theory of Interest and Money, in 1936. And in that particular book, he has written a monetary theory of interest, which is called liquidity preference theory. According to this theory, interest is the price of the service of money. It is reward for parting with the liquidity for a specified period of time. According to him, money has two functions. One, medium of exchange, and second, store of wealth. Whereas classical theory says that money has only one function, that is medium of exchange. Otherwise, money is neutral. It doesn't affect the real fact of economy. Whereas classical Keynes says that no, money has another function, that is store of wealth also. It can affect the real factor of the economy. For classical, money is neutral. Money cannot increase or decrease the real factor of economy. But Keynes neglect these. The demand for money, according to Keynes, is expressed in terms of liquidity preference. According to Keynes, the demand for money is nothing but preference for liquidity. Demand for money is preference for liquidity. The wealth is generally preferred to be kept in cash in any society, according to Keynes. And if wealth or money or income is kept in cash, it can be used for the purpose, and there is no difficulty, and it will be facility to use the income at desire. According to him, wealth can be kept in the form of land, building, share, debentures, government securities, etc. But it cannot be used in the form of money or cash when it is required. Thus, liquidity basically means the cash. Liquidity we'll discuss here with reference to rate of interest. If any society people prefer to keep their income in the form of liquidity, then we have to pay high rate of interest according to Keynes. People will prepare to part with liquidity when they are paid higher rate of interest. And when the rate of interest is low, they will prefer to keep it in liquid form. This is the base of this theory. Thus, interest is a reward for parting the liquidity. Hence, higher the liquidity preference, higher will be the rate of interest, and lower the liquidity preference, lower will be the rate of interest. Positive and proportional relationship. Higher liquidity preference will be, if then rate of interest will be higher, and less, then there will be less. Keynes further explained, basically people prefer cash for other forms of money to fulfill three motives. It's very, very important. Keynes says that people kept money for three motives. Transaction motive first, day-to-day purchasing, day to day fulfill the basic requirement or other requirement. Precautionary motive means, second is precautionary motive, which means for the safeguard of future, to overcome the uncertainty. Third is speculative motive, which is basically for the investment purpose or for market purpose. Let us discuss in detail what is transaction motive. When people demand liquid money to carry out their day-to-day transaction and the demand for cash, liquidity is known as the transaction motive. Whether the people or maybe the business firm, people need money to travel, for example, one place to another. They need money to buy goods and services. They need money for daily requirement, basic requirement, and that requirement is called the transaction demand, transaction motive. They are required to stock some money in cash with them to fulfill these basic requirement. Transaction motive of the people is largely depend on the size of income that people earn. Means it directly depend upon the income level. Higher level income, the transaction motive will be high. Rich people will kept more money as compared to the poor people. If your income is less, then you will kept less transaction motive. Poor people have less demand for transaction motive as compared to rich people. Higher income level, the more will be the demand for money according to Keynes. Therefore, the transaction demand for cash people is this is cash for people of people is the income elastic. Transaction demand, transaction motive is income elastic. Higher income, higher will be the transaction motive. This can be expressed in like T is the function of Y. Here Y means income, T means the transaction motive. Transaction motive directly, it depends upon income. Income is independent. Precautionary motive, people attempt to meet contingencies and unforeseen circumstances. They may happen in the future by saving. Hence, the demand for liquidity to safeguard their future is known as the precautionary motive. Precautionary motive, like transaction motive, it is income elastic. Because of it is also depend on the income of the individual. Higher income, more will be the precautionary motive. They will prefer more the precautionary demand for money, and less, definitely there will be less precautionary motive. Thus, precautionary demand for liquidity can be expressed like P is the function of income. Here, precautionary motive depends upon your income. Income is the independent. This is dependent factor. It is the function of income. If we add precautionary plus transaction motive, that is both are function of income. M1 here represents the demand for money as a result of transactions and precautionary motive. Whether the transaction motive or precautionary motive, both are the function of income. Both depends upon the income. Third is the speculative motive. This is the most important motive behind the demand for liquidity in this theory. When people demand for liquidity with the motive of taking advantage of the changes in the price level of the securities and debentures and so on, then it is known as the speculative motive for liquidity. The liquidity preference is influenced by the speculative motive according to Keynes. The rate of interest and the price of bond and securities share has inverse relationship according to this theory. People's expectations are based upon this relationship. They expect the price of bond and security to increase when the rate of interest fall, and when the rate of interest increase, when the rate of interest increase, the price of bonds and securities will decrease according to the speculative motive. Now, what is liquidity preference curve? The demand for liquidity based upon the expectations basically. Interest rate differs inversely with liquidity preference for the speculative motive we have discussed. The speculative demand for liquidity can be expressed like M2. Speculative motive is the function of rate of interest, not money. Transaction motive, precautionary motive is the function of income, whereas M2 is the function of rate of interest. It depends upon the rate of interest. There is an inverse relationship between the rate of interest and speculative motive. Let us discuss with the help of following figures. Like this is the demand for speculative motive. LPC is the demand for speculative motive for money. This side we have rate of interest and demand for money. This curve shows the relationship between demand for money and rate of interest. Higher the rate of interest, lower the demand for money, and lower the rate of interest, higher the demand for money. But the interesting point here is to be noted that when a rate of interest, for example, this R1, this is the minimum point of below which the rate of interest will not decrease. Means any increase or decrease of rate of interest beyond this point will not affect the demand for money or LPC. This part, when that the rate of interest is minimum, this is known as the liquidity trap. According to Keynes, the rate of interest cannot fall below an institutional determined minimum limit. This concept, this is referred to liquidity trap. When the rate of interest is minimum, see this part, A2, AB, and so on, this LPC, this is the liquidity trap. This part is known as liquidity trap. Second is money supply. The supply of money is interest elastic. Means the supply of money in an economy is controlled by the government or maybe monetary authority of the government like RBI we have in India or the central bank in other countries, and cannot be influenced by the individual. That's why the money supply curve is inelastic. As per this theory, the supply of money remain constant in the economy in the short run. This whole theory is based on the short run, because of Keynes assume that in the long run we all die. There is no long run, everything resides in the short run. And even the Keynesian theory is based on the demand side theory, which says that demand creates its own supply, not supply creates its own demand. Whereas classical theory says that supply creates its own demand, but Keynesian theory says no, demand creates its own supply. So in case of money supply, this theory assumes that money supply is interest inelastic. This supply curve therefore be parallel to the x-axis like this one. See this diagram. This is interest elastic, means any change in rate of interest will not affect the supply of money. That's why it is the interest elastic. Now, according to the important point determining the equilibrium rate of interest, where the rate of interest will be determined. Classical says that the demand for capital is equal to the demand for money, supply of money, that is the point of the equilibrium point. Whereas new classical says that the point where the loanable fund is equal to the supply of loanable fund, that is the point of equilibrium. But according to Keynes, the rate of interest is determined by the point at which demand for liquidity is equal to the supply of money supply. In other words, interest rate is determined by the equilibrium between demand for and supply of money. See, with the help of this diagram, we can see this. This is the rate of this side we have rate of interest. X-axis we have money and demand for money and supply of money. SS is the supply of money curve, and LPC is the demand for money, and the point where the demand for money intersect the supply, this is the equilibrium point. OR is the rate of interest. SE is the rate of, sorry, this is the rate of interest. And suppose the supply of money will decrease B to A, then rate of interest will increase. And if the supply of money will increase, then rate of interest will fall. Increase and decrease of the money supply due to there are various methods, quantitative, qualitative theories are there. We'll discuss some other lectures. But if there's a change, for example, if there's a change in, when there's a change in liquidity preference of the people, then it has an impact on the interest rate also. And for example, assume that there is a high demand for liquidity, then the LPC curve will shift upward side, and this also lead as the change in rate of interest. And similarly, when people's demand of liquidity is low, then it will shift downward side, and it will affect the rate of interest. For example, this is the initial equilibrium point, E is the initial equilibrium point, and OR is the rate of interest, as this diagram shown, that Y on OY we have the rate of interest, and x-axis we have the demand for and supply of money. And if the demand for money will increase, for example, then the LPC will shift LPC1, and new equilibrium will be there, that is E1. And if the demand for money will decrease, then there will be decrease in rate of interest, and new equilibrium point will be E2. So shift in liquidity curve will also affect the demand for money, sorry, the rate of interest. Now this theory has also some limitations. For example, the theory concentrated only monetary factor, which is the most important drawbacks of this theory. Critics said that liquidity preference theory was indeterminate theory. You cannot say this is the perfect theory. According to Keynes, demand for liquidity depends upon the transaction precautionary motive, which is not true. The three motive, basically, there can be the speculative demand for liquidity cannot determine without the that rate of interest. This lead a situation where the determination of rate of interest itself depend upon the rate of interest. Thus this theory is not the practical theory, because of the various there can be various motive. For example, the not only three motive, transaction motive, speculative motive, but there can be deflationary motive for expand the business transaction, etc. So various motive can be there. Thus it cannot be say that the demand for liquidity arises only out of the three motive, that is transactions, precautionary, and speculative motive. So let us summarize whole this lecture, this module. In the first part we have discussed interest. Interest is the reward for lending capital to others. There are various definitions, but we have discussed briefly one by one, three theories. Even we have discussed the two important components, that is gross interest and net interest. Three theories: classical theory of interest, new classical theory, liquidity preference we have discussed. Classical theory, rate of interest, says that the rate of interest will determine where the demand for capital is equal to the supply of capital, whereas new classical say no, loanable funds play important role, where demand for loanable funds is equal to the loanable supply, the funds of loanable supply. That point will be equilibrium point. Whereas third important theory, that Keynesian theory of liquidity preference theory of interest, this said that the point where demand for money is equal to the supply of money, that is the point of determination of rate of interest. With this, thank you very much.